What if I told you Timothy Dalton starred in a James Bond video game in 1993, 4 years after his last James Bond movie? Yep, that was a game, James Bond 007 The Duel, for Sega Genesis. When the video game adaptation of the film GoldenEye was first announced, it was originally supposed to be a 2D platformer for the Super Nintendo, made by Rare, hot off the heels of Donkey Kong Country. Now, obviously that didn't happen. GoldenEye's development migrated over to the Nintendo 64, where it became the first-person shooter we all know and love. But I always wondered what a James Bond 2D platformer would look like. As one of the Nintendo faithful growing up, little did I know that the Sega Genesis had its own James Bond game, The Duel, starring Timothy Dalton, who hadn't played James Bond since 1989, 4 years before the game's release. So, what is The Duel? Well, it's pretty much what you'd expect from a licensed game from the early 90s. It's a 2D side-scroller. Bond runs, jumps, shoots his way through a gauntlet of bad guys. But it's not a fast run-and-gun game like Contra. It's not a brawler like the Ninja Turtles games. And it's not an exploration game like Super Metroid. And it's not a straight platformer like Mario. The Duel is not a game where Bond just has to get to the end of the level to complete it. The Duel is one of those platformers where the levels are mazes, and the player has to find X number of MacGuffins before moving on to the exit. And in this case, the MacGuffins are beautiful women. After all the beautiful women are rescued/found in the level, Bond sets off a bomb to destroy the level, and the player must escape before time runs out. The bomb timer mechanic is perhaps a bit unfair and makes things more difficult than they need to be. For example, in the first level, after setting off the bomb, Bond is given 60 seconds to find the exit, which is hectic and stressful enough as it is. But then Bond runs into famous henchman and friend of the show, Jaws. So the first level expects players to find an escape, which is not immediately visible and actually several screens away, and defeat a boss, all in 60 seconds. But being unfair and making things more difficult than they need to be really is the name of the game with The Duel. This is one of those games where if the character falls from too great a height, he dies. The original Donkey Kong did this. I get it, it's realistic. You fall from a height 10 times taller than you, you're probably not going to make it. But it's not exactly fun. And I mean, this isn't a problem in and of itself, but it is magnified by two things. Bond has an extremely long knockback distance, about 1/3 of the screen. And there are some very tricky platforming spots where Bond can get shot and then be sent flying back off the platform to his death. The second is that the art design doesn't always make clear what is a platform that Bond can step on and what's just a background element that happens to look like a platform. Now, there are several times when I'd run off of cliffs to my death because I didn't realize the platform had ended. The developer and publisher of The Duel, Domark, actually made several James Bond games during the 80s and 90s. They made a View to a Kill game for the Commodore 64, which I'd love to check out at some point. And I say that, but if this is any indicator of their output, I'm out. Domark also worked on the Sega Genesis port of Prince of Persia before The Duel came out, which actually informs a lot of the way that Bond moves and why the platforming is so unforgiving. And I think the game is so merciless because it's so short. It's only 5 levels. I mean, to be fair, they're fairly in-depth and lengthy levels, but the whole kit and caboodle can be beaten in less than an hour if you know what you're doing. The bosses are a who's who of classic James Bond villains and henchmen. Jaws gave me a lot of trouble. He loved grabbing me by the throat and then throwing me into shark-infested waters. I mean, this is just silly enough to work with me. Oddjob throws a hat, Mayday karate kicks, and Baron Samedi, yeah, he's in this game. He throws some rings. Now, to me, The Duel doesn't really use the James Bond license to its fullest extent. I'm not saying there needed to be cutscenes, but the Bond persona and the Bond world never really gets a chance to shine through. It's very much a generic platformer/shooter that just happens to feature a protagonist with a suit and a gun. But there aren't any gadgets, there aren't any one-liners, or even anything that would hint at spy work. The levels don't scream James Bond. There's generic boat, generic laboratory, generic forest, and I don't remember James Bond ever jumping through trees. Wait, scratch that. Roger Moore did once swing on vines and yell like Tarzan once. That did happen. Yeah, that did happen. And actually, the 4th level looks like it's taken out of You Only Live Twice, complete with a secret volcano lair and henchmen in yellow jumpsuits. Short, The Duel could be better. I was really excited for it. It was supposed to be the Super Nintendo GoldenEye that never was that I dreamt about for the last 20 years, but it's just a sloppy game. It's got sloppy elements that keep it in the area of bad to mediocre, which is disappointing. It's a James Bond video game with an original story starring Timothy Dalton from 1993. How do you screw that up? Well, here's how.